Alright, so this is chapter 2 of part 1 of The Devils by Fyodor Dostoevsky. I don't claim for a moment that he had never suffered for his convictions, but I am fully convinced now that he could have gone on lecturing on his Arabs as much as he liked if he had only given the necessary explanations. But at the time he allowed himself to be carried away by his ambition and was much too hasty in assuming once for all that his career had been completely ruined by the whirlwind of events. And if the whole truth is to be told, the real cause of the change in his career was the highly delicate proposal that had been made before and renewed again by Varvara Petrovna Stavrogin, the wife of a lieutenant general and a woman of considerable means, to undertake the education and the whole intellectual development of her only son in the capacity of a superior tutor and friend, to say nothing of a magnificent salary. The proposal had been made to him for the first time in Berlin, and as a matter of fact, just at the time of the death of his first wife. His first wife was a frivolous girl from our province whom he married when he was still a rather thoughtless young man. I believe he had had a great deal of trouble with that young woman, who, by the way, was very attractive, owing to his inability to support her and for other partly delicate reasons too. She died in Paris, having been separated from him for 3 years before, leaving him a 5-year-old son, the fruit of our first joyous and still unclouded love, as the grief-stricken Mr. Verkovensky once put it, in my presence. The boy had been sent to Russia, where he was brought up by some distant aunts in some remote province. Mr. Verkovensky had declined Mrs. Stavrogin's proposal on that occasion and had quickly married again before the year was out, a taciturn Berlin girl, and that too without any particular necessity for him to do so. But apart from his marriage, there were other reasons why he refused to accept the post of a tutor. He was tempted by the resounding fame of a professor who enjoyed great popularity at the time, and he too was eager to accept the offer of a university lectureship, for which he had been preparing himself to try his eagle wings, and now with seeing wings he naturally remembered the offer which even before had made him wonder whether he had been right in refusing it. The sudden death of his second wife, who did not live a year with him, settled the matter definitely. Let me be quite frank. Everything was settled by the passionate sympathy, the priceless and classical friendship of Mrs. Stavrogin, if indeed one may use such an expression about friendship. He flung himself into the arms of that friendship, and the whole thing was settled for 20 years. I use the expression flung himself into the arms, but don't let anyone jump to any rash and improper conclusions. Those arms have to be understood only in the highest possible moral sense. These two remarkable things were joined forever in a union that was most refined and delicate. Mr. Verkovensky also accepted the post of a tutor because the property he had inherited from his first wife, a very small one, was close to Skvoreshniki, the magnificent estate of the Stavrogins, within a few miles of our town. Besides, it was always possible for him to devote himself to the cause of learning and enrich Russian literature by the most profound researches in the seclusion of his study and without any interference from the enormous amount of university work. These researches did not appear, but on the other hand, he found it possible to spend the rest of his life, more than 20 years, a living monument of reproach, as it were, to his country, in the words of a popular poet, a living monument of reproach. Thou stoodest before thy country, O liberal idealist. Perhaps the person the poet had in mind had a right to pose like that all his life if he wanted to, however boring he may have found it. But our Mr. Verkovensky, to tell the truth, was only an imitator compared with such people, and besides, he got very quickly tired of standing and very often preferred to lie down. But to do him justice, even in his recumbent position, he preserved the living monument of reproach, particularly as that alone was quite sufficient for our provincial public. You ought to have seen him at our club when he sat down to cards. His whole attitude seemed to say, "Cards. Me sit down to whist with you. Is it in keeping with my position? But who is responsible for that? Who ruined my career and turned it into a whist? Oh, perish Russia. And he would majestically trump with a heart. And to tell the truth, he was very fond of a game of cards, which, especially in later years, led to frequent and unpleasant squabbles with Mrs. Stavrogin, particularly as he was always losing. But of that later. I wish to merely to point out that he was a man of a tender conscience, sometimes that is, and that was why he was so often depressed. In the course of his 20 years friendship with Mrs. Stavrogin, he regularly 3 or 4 times a year fell into what is known among us as a state of civic grief, that is to say, into a fit of the blackest depression. But our highly esteemed Mrs. Stavrogin liked that particular expression. Later on, he succumbed not only to civic grief but also to champagne. But the tactful Mrs. Stavrogin protected him all his life from his trivial inclinations, and as a matter of fact, he was in need of a nurse, for sometimes he behaved very queerly. In the midst of the most exalted grief, he would suddenly burst out laughing in a most common manner. There were moments when he would even start talking to himself in a humorous vein, and Mrs. Stavrogin feared nothing so much as his humorous vein. She was a woman of the classical type, a female Maecenas, I don't know what the fuck that is, who always acted from the highest possible motives. The influence of this great lady on her poor friend for 20 years was of a most fundamental kind. I ought really to speak of her separately, which I now propose to do. End of chapter 2.